Okay, so tonight's Torah portion. Vayeshev. Vayeshev, and it simply means, and he lived. Vayeshev, and he lived. So tonight's Torah portion has to do, of course, with Yaakov and where he lived in Hebron. But actually, it has more to do with Joseph, and surprisingly, has a great deal to do with Judah. I think the strongest relevancy of this Torah portion tonight is, in fact, Judah and what happens with Judah. We're going to see a transformative experience, not as distinct and profound as it was with Jacob, but as powerful as with Jacob. But the Bible, what we see in tonight's Torah portion, doesn't give us the insight that we have with the story of Jacob. But we're going to see a turnaround in Yehudah that's very important for us. And I think this is where we're going to put the earnest of tonight's message on Yehudah's transformation, Judah's transformation. But we're going to talk about Jacob just a little bit, not too much, but Joseph as well. Okay, so where did Joseph live at this time? Yaakov and the entire family, they lived in Hebron, which is exactly 48 miles. I checked it. 48.6 miles actually from Shechem. And that's quite a walk, right? But we know that in tonight's Torah portion that the sons of Jacob left Hebron to go to Shechem to tend to the flocks that were in Shechem. Now, also, we know that Joseph walked from Hebron to Shechem, from tonight's Torah portion as well. His father sent him from Hebron to walk to Shechem, 48.6.2 miles or something. That's comparative, I think, to perhaps walking from here to Ormond Beach. I think Ormond Beach is right about 48 miles from where we are right now. So it's quite a walk, it's quite a length. In the ancient world, you would walk that. You simply had to, right? Now, so let's talk about tonight's Torah portion in regards to Joseph. Let's just talk about the narrative. I'm just going to relate the broader narrative for you. Joseph, he is anointed, right? He's chosen by God. He is certainly appointed by God. We know that from the broader context of the story and what God does with him relative to him going to Egypt and becoming an archetypal figure of Messiah and the redemption that God will bring. So we know that Joseph is an important figure in the Bible, but his brothers didn't quite know it at that time, and neither did his mom and dad. So he had a couple of dreams that we'll talk about. Before the dream, there was a conflict that came before the dreams, and that conflict had to do with Jacob's, Israel's, love for Joseph, particularly for Joseph. Why did he love Joseph more than the others? The Bible says because he was the son of his old age, which is true. He also had that type of a special love and a attention for Benjamin as well. But I want to submit to you that there are other reasons for his love towards Joseph and Benjamin, and it has to do with Rachel. Right? So Rachel was the wife that he fell in love with. He ended up with Leah, Bilhah, and Zilhah, who were the concubines, and his wife also was Leah. But he had a special place in his heart for Rachel because he waited for 7 years to have Rachel, to be his wife. So actually, his whole time in Mesopotamia was about Rachel. So he had deep love for Rachel, and of course, Joseph was one of the the first son of Rachel, and then Benjamin followed. So he had a special love for Joseph. And what did he do to express that love? He got him a multicolored tunic, right? A tunic of many colors. And that expressed Israel's particular love and preference for Joseph. How did his brothers feel about that tunic? Didn't like it much. Didn't like it much. On top of that, of course, Joseph was a dreamer. they said that he was they referred to him as that dreamer. But from the standpoint of God's work and what God would ultimately do, he was much more than just a dreamer. When they referred to him as a dreamer, it was sort of a negative connotation to it, right? No. He received prophetic dreams from God that he had to share with his brothers. Sometimes people say, well, he was a bit of a snob. He wasn't wise in doing what he did. He should have known better. But I say no. I say Joseph did exactly what God wanted him to do. Had he not shared his dreams, both dreams, with his brothers, he would have not gone into Egypt. Because what we're going to see here in a few minutes is that his brothers decided, because of the dreams, that they would kill him. Ultimately, they would send him into Egypt. So what I'm saying to you is, it was God's purpose and his foreordination that Joseph would share his dreams. He wasn't just being unwise or being foolish or snobby or anything. He was doing what the Holy Spirit led him to do. Now that's my obvious opinion. I think it's very obvious in the Bible that that's entirely true. So God used the dreams to offset things in such a way to send Joseph into Egypt. We know the rest of the story. Joseph went into Egypt at the age of 17. We don't know how many years he spent at Potiphar's prison, but he came out of Potiphar's prison, which is next week's Torah Portion, and he ascends to be at the right hand of God, of Pharaoh himself, which is a picture of Jesus sitting at the right hand of God, which we'll talk about next week. That typology is very important. It is extremely important. That typology is an affront to Jewish apologetics, and for obvious reasons. I've been considering lately Jewish apologetics, and it's unfortunate what I see many of the apologists resorting to do. They cling in a desperate sense to prove that Jesus is not the Messiah and that all Christians are entirely wrong. Very unfortunate. But one of the struggles they have is this particular typology that we find in the Bible relative to Joseph and Jesus. It's very hard to look away from it. It's very clear. Nevertheless. So Joseph is a dreamer. What was his dreams? What was his two dreams? What two dreams did he have? The first one was sheaves, bundles of sheaves. And what was the nature of the dream? That Jacob's bundle of sheaves, or Israel's sheaves, will bow down to his sheaf. Now, the sheaves there is representative of the sons of Israel, right? And that they will all bow down to him, in other words, and which of course we understand from a prophetic sense exactly that happened. And then he had a second dream. Now, when God gives us a dream, what do we know concerning dreams? When dreams are prophetic from God, he would usually confirm it with a second dream along the same lines. And so he gives Joseph a second dream, which he is to share with his brothers, all a part of God's purpose. And the second dream was what? The sun and the moon and the 12 and the 11 stars will bow down to him. All right? Which is exactly, we know what happened. Now, this infuriated the brothers to no end, right? This really, really infuriated them. In fact, because of the dreams, they decided that he had to go. You know, the court was bad enough. Now he's dreaming dreams about his lordship over us. He's got to go. So what we're going to see here is that when they determined to get rid of him, they basically said, well, let's get rid of him and see if those dreams would be, fulfilled. In other words, in order not to have those dreams fulfilled, let's kill him, is what they concluded. All right, let's just read about that. In Genesis chapter 37, I'm going to read for you 18 to 20. So again, here comes Joseph. He's walked all the way, 48.62 miles, all the way from Hebron. They see him coming from a distance and concluded that, well, here comes that dreamer of dreams. We notice him because of that multicolored coat. We can see him a mile away. Here he comes. Let's kill him and ensure that the dream is never fulfilled, is kind of what they say. So let's read it. 18 to 20. When they saw him from a distance and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. So what was the plot? Put him to death. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And we will say, a wild beast devoured him, and let us see what will become of his dreams. In other words, let's kill him so that his dreams would not be fulfilled, and we will not bow down to him. That's kind of the statement that they're making. So what do you think of that? Yeah, they tells us, first of all, that they had a sense that the dreams were real, the dreams were accurate, and that, yes, it's apparent that we will bow down to him. In order for us to prevent that from happening, we simply kill him. You know, to a certain extent, there was some of that with Jesus at the cross. Caiaphas said it's expedient that one man should die for the nation of Israel. So there's a sense there that Caiaphas and maybe some of the leadership, the Sanhedrin, sort of knew who Jesus was, but couldn't accept him. Why? Because he didn't fit the mold that they had created for themselves concerning who Mashiach is. You've got to understand that the political environment at the time of Jesus, particularly at the time of his crucifixion, was at an apex, its highest point. Rome was becoming uneasy about the zealots and about the prospect of a coming Mashiach. You know, the people are all excited. Even the religious leaders, the Sadducees, were even excited about the coming of Mashiach. And so here is this Yeshua who's going about now for 3 years performing miracles. And the miracles are hard to refute. And so even Nicodemus is, and they all, from the standpoint of the leadership, they would say, even Nicodemus is believing him. Perhaps, we don't know, but he can't be. Why? He's from Galilee. He's from Nazareth. He can't be the Messiah. He's not one of us. So perhaps there was a sentiment or an idea within the leadership that, well, just get rid of him. If he's the Messiah, we won't be able to kill him. What do you think? You think that statement was made? You know, let's put him to the cross. If he's the Messiah, he'll come off the cross. But they had no notion, of course, that the cross was essential. The cross was Joseph going into Egypt. Let us kill him, is what his brother said. Now, let's talk about Reuben. Reuben, what do we know about Reuben? He's not real sharp. Right? What has he done to this point that reflects that Reuben isn't the sharpest tack on the wall? He took his father's concubine. He took one of his father's concubine. Not a smart thing to do when you're among a tribe of about 50 people. News gets wrong, right? And so he does this thing, and of course, that nullified him pretty quickly. Now, later on in next week's Torah portion, we're going to see even more buffoonery on the part of Reuben. Next week's Torah portion, we'll talk about it next week. I'll leave that as a mystery for you. So next week we'll discover more of Reuben's buffoonery, okay? But here now Reuben, instead of seizing the opportunity to present himself as the true leader of Israel, he decides that he's going to intervene, but tepidly. He's not going to take a strong stand. You know, and say, what are you doing? How can you ever think about killing your own brother? Instead of doing that, he says, let's not kill him. Let's throw him into a ditch. That's Reuben, right? That's a good move if you're really afraid of your brothers. But you see, Reuben, I think, had an opportunity here to just put his foot down and put his life on the line if necessary for what is right and what is correct. But he didn't. He found a way out, right? Let's read about what Reuben did. 21 to 24, Reuben here. But Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, let us not take his life. Reuben further said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him, that he might rescue, this is what he's thinking, that he might rescue him out of their hands, and restore him to his father. So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the varied colored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty, without any water in it. So this is Reuben. My point is, Reuben could have done better as a leader. He would have had to make a very difficult decision, one that would have even jeopardized himself with his brothers. He already knew that his brothers was thinking murder. He knew that they were murderous concerning Joseph. So he's standing there and he says, well, if I take a hard stand, they would want to murder me as well, perhaps is what he was saying. He refused to put his life on the line, came up with a compromise. That's what he did. My point is, he could have done much better as a leader. He could have really impressed God, and actually ascend further into a place, or descend further into a place of leadership. Remember that? You never ascend into leadership. You always descend into leadership. Always. You always do. How did Jesus become the ultimate leader of humanity? He descended from the right hand of God to become a servant of all, to give his life a ransom for everyone. He descended. So how do you become a leader? You have to descend. That's the picture there for us. And so Reuben couldn't descend in order to become the leader that he was supposed to be. Let's talk about Judah now. Judah at this point, he's the fourth son of Yaakov, of Israel. No chance from a natural point of view of him becoming the leader of the people of Israel. Why? He's number 4. You have Reuben. Should Reuben not become the leader, you have Simeon and Levi. That's in line before Judah can ever be the leader. So Judah here, by the way, who has natural leadership proclivity, tendency, he has it. It's going to develop later into next week's Torah portion. At the end of tonight's Torah portion, we're going to see a jump, a leap in Judah's proclivity towards leadership. It's a wonderful story, and we'll see it. We'll see Judah begin to morph into that servant, that leader, that ultimately he would come to be. And he will offer his life, next week's Torah portion, twice. He would offer his life to his father and then to Joseph. So consider that. Consider that. He will offer his life to his own father and then secondarily to Joseph. The two that was offended the most by the buffoonery of his brothers. He would lay his life down before both of them. Now let's talk about Judah. What does Judah do? Now Reuben sort of saved Joseph from being killed, but he could have done better, right? But he didn't. Throw him in a pit. You throw someone in a pit, there's no water, just leave him there with the hope of coming back to rescue him. What could anything have gone wrong with his plan? What do you think? How did he not know that there were scorpions down in that pit? How did he not know that there were vipers down in that pit? How did he not know that a wild beast wouldn't come and rip him out of there and destroy him? You see? So Reuben isn't functioning fully. But Judah now has an opportunity to step into some dimension of leadership, and he does. Doesn't put his life fully on the line, but he puts his mouth where his leadership would ultimately be. In other words, he begins to speak on behalf of that reality that he would ultimately become the leader of the tribes of Israel. And let's read what Judah does and what he says. 25 and 26, Genesis chapter 37. Then they sat down to eat a meal. And they raised up their eyes and looked. Behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing aromatic gum, I almost said rum, and balm and myrrh. So these are merchandise from the east that they're taken into Egypt, Africa, for commerce, on their way to bring them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood?" So Judah, to this point, he's still thinking that they're going to kill him. He's smart enough to know that if you leave him in this pit, he's going to die. So you didn't kill him immediately upon arrival. You threw him in this pit, Reuben, but he's going to die anyway. So Judah has the right perspective. He says, "Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he's our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. So he was sold into slavery. Okay? Now, certainly Judah could have pulled his staff and his sword perhaps and say, "All right, this is enough. He's going back to Hebron with me." He could have done that, but that was not God's plan. It's not God's plan. God's plan was for him to do exactly what Judah said. Not what Reuben said, but what Judah said. Let us sell him into slavery. So who's hearing from God here? Reuben or Judah? Who's being moved by the Spirit of God? Judah. Ultimately, the Spirit of God moving in Judah will bring him to the crucible in his life where he would become the leader of Israel. And the crucible in his life is what we're going to talk about right now. So following this incredible event, what happens? The brothers of Joseph decides to take his coat, take a yearling, a young kid, and kill it, and put blood on that coat, take that coat back to Israel and present that to him as proof that your son is dead. And they do just that, and then Yaakov is like, "Surely my son is dead. He's been devoured by a wild animal." So, from the standpoint of Israel, it's a done deal. But what we see here exactly in the next chapter, in fact, the first verse of the next chapter, chapter 38, is that Judah has abandoned ship. Judah is like, "Okay, I'm leaving." He's no longer with the tribes of Israel. We don't see that anywhere before. Not with any of the descendants of Abraham, where they would just walk away from the people of Abraham. In the case with Judah, the people of Israel, because the tribes were already beginning to coalesce and form, sons of Israel. He walked completely away. What's happening to Judah? He's in a free fall. He's in a free fall. I want to say to you that Judah considered the mess of his family and said, "This is a dysfunctional mess. I'm leaving." That's my position, and we'll talk about that in a moment. It's as if Judah said, "You guys are a mess. Sleeping with your mother's concubine, your father's concubine, killing the men at Shechem. You guys are the leaders. Simeon, Reuben, and Levi. You guys are the leaders, and this is what you're doing." And then the whole situation with Joseph on top of it, Judah is like, "That's it. You guys are nuts. I'm leaving. I'm going to become a Canaanite." And that's what Judah does. He literally leaves the tribes of Israel and joins himself to the Canaanites. What did we talk about last week? Last week's Torah portion, when God led Jacob from Shechem to Bethel and then to Hebron, that God watched over the people of Israel so that they would not assimilate. Here is Judah. He's up to here with the whole mess, and he's assimilating. He's gone off to be a Canaanite. What we're going to see here is that he worships as a Canaanite. Temple prostitution, fertility worship. He gets involved in the worst type of Canaanite behavior. Again, I'm convinced that he said, "That's it, you guys are nuts, this family is dysfunctional. I don't want to be a son of Israel anymore. I want to be it's better to live with the pagans than to live with you guys." And we see that immediately in chapter 38. Let me just read some of 38 for you to validate what I'm saying. And it came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. Departed, gone off. He's hooking up with Adullamite now. These are Canaanites. Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her and went into her, so she becomes his wife. He marries Shua, who is a Canaanite. So she conceived and bore a son and named him Then she conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. She bore him still another son and named him Shelah, and it was at Kezib, that she bore him. So what we know, what do we know from the text that we just read? That Judah is moving about because she bore Shelah at Kezib. In other words, the other two were born at other places. Why is he moving about? Because he's a shepherd. He's a shepherd, and he's a Canaanite, as a matter of fact, but he's a shepherd, and he's moving around with his Canaanite family. Now, we're going to see something here that's pretty profound when you look at it. But Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord took his life. How many pulpits come Sunday morning is going to be talking about that story right there? I'm not going to talk about it on Sunday morning, but how many Christian leaders or preachers, pastors will bring that up? He was evil in the sight of God and God killed him. Is that what it says? God took his life. Pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. Remember the theme that we've been talking about in the past couple of weeks? To whom much is given, much is required. Is that true? So was evil. Then Judah said to Onan, go, no, wait a minute. But Judah's husband, and God took his life. Oh, we forgot to read verse 6. No, we didn't. We did. Her name was Tamar. No, we didn't. Now Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. So here comes Tamar. Tamar was the wife of died, he was evil. Then Judah said to Onan, his second son, go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring to your brother, which was the custom of that time. Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother. So what do we know about this new family of Judah? They're a little bit dysfunctional as well. Perhaps the problem is not only Yaakov, but perhaps in Judah as well. But what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, I am afraid that he too may die like his brothers. So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. Now, from the standpoint of the ancient community, Canaanite community, Tamar was cursed. Her life was worthless. She would die a widow, perhaps a rejected and miserable life she would experience. This is Tamar's lot. How fair is this? How reasonable is this? Certainly Tamar is not liking this at all. This is unfair. Some time goes by and Tamar understands, she recognizes that Judah has no intention, none, of allowing Shelah to raise a child with her. What is Judah saying? This woman is bad for my family. 2 sons, and they're both dead, no seed. So he is rejecting Tamar at this point. And Shelah is not quite ready and never will marry Tamar. And Tamar is not foolish, she understands it. What does she do? She comes up with a plan. She has a plan. And what was the plan? to lure Judah into a mistake, to lure him into an act that would expose his unfairness. Now remember that Judah is no longer an Israelite for all practical purposes. He's functioning as a Canaanite. What we're going to see next is that he goes into who he believes is a temple prostitute, which was the custom of the Canaanite people. You worship Ishtar or Ashtoreth by going into the temple prostitute. Typically in the ancient world, you would have temples, and depending on the size of the temple, the community, you would have a corresponding amount of prostitutes. The prostitutes were not there for recreation. Okay, we need to understand that. The prostitutes were there for religious purposes. To go into a priest of Ishtar, who would be the prostitute, is to assure yourself good crops, that your flocks will flourish and that it will go well with you. You will have many sons and they will have many sons, and you will be blessed, because Ishtar was a fertility goddess, and Tamar, ironically, disguises herself as a fertility priestess, prostitute. You can see the irony, right? So now let's pick it up in verse 20. All right, let's see. Let's go back a little bit. He sees, so verse 16, he sees the temple prostitute, who he thinks is the temple prostitute. Verse 17. He said, therefore I will send you, okay, no, wait, we have to back up. So Tamar, he encounters Tamar, he engages Tamar, and what does Tamar say? What are you going to give me for this transaction? He says, I'll give you my signet ring, my cord, and my staff. My signet ring, my cord, and my staff. Now think about this. His signet ring. He was a businessman, right? He was a shepherd. He was a businessman. How important is that signet ring? Very important. How important was the cord? What did the cord represent? The signet ring represented what? His authority. Who I am, my name. His name was on that seal. My name, my authority. What did the cord represent? This is what he would gird himself with. His strength. The cord represented his strength. The thing that, again, that he would gird himself with. What did the staff represent? His ministry. He was a shepherd. His ministry. So those three items are significant. He relinquished to this goddess figure, this temple prostitute. He relinquished his authority, his strength, and his ministry. Everything. Everything is what he surrendered. So you see there the condition of Judah, right? He's in a very sad state of a free fall. That he is left, he's abandoned his brothers, he's abandoned his heritage as an Israelite. He's in disarray because his sons are dying, he has no offspring, and then he's about to give up everything with the hopes of being blessed with fertility in sleeping with this temple prostitute. So then in verse 20, I'm going to read for you verse 20 to 26. When Judah sent the young goat to his friend, the Adullamite, to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. He asked the man of the place, saying, where is the temple prostitute who was by the road at Enaim? Enaim is some pagan community, but they said, there has been no temple prostitute here. So he returned to Judah and said, I did not find her. And furthermore, the man of the place said that there has been no temple prostitute here. Now, Judah is in a pickle. He's in a predicament. He's given up everything that's meaningful to his life. He's about to be embarrassed, right? And what does he do? He brushes it off. Okay, let's just ignore it and move on. You see the condition that Judah is in. This doesn't upset him that he's going to lose his signet ring, his cord, and his staff. Yeah, at this point, again, he's likely in a free fall, complete. Then Judah said, let her keep them, otherwise we'll become a laughingstock. After all, I sent a young goat, but you did not find her. So just envision where he is. Now it came about 3 months later when Judah was informed, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot. And behold, she is also with child by harlotry. Then Judah said, bring her out and let her be burnt. So Judah is having a spell of some righteous indignation at this point, right? Suddenly he's looking for righteousness. You know, his daughter-in-law Tamar, she's played the harlot, burn her. Perhaps he's saying, this is one way to ensure that she doesn't marry my son, Shelah. Here it is. Thank you, Ishtar. She doesn't get to marry my son, Shelah. She gets to be burned to the stake, perhaps. But how righteous is Judah here? Again, he's in a free fall, folks. He's not caring about any dimension of righteousness. His personality of that was of a son of Israel, knowing righteousness. Do you think Judah was brought up knowing righteousness? Being told the stories concerning Abraham from his father Isaac, from his father Jacob? He interacted with Isaac. Do you think perhaps Judah knew the reality of what it was to be an Israelite? Of course he did. At this point he doesn't care. It's all gone. It's all for naught at this point. Whatever. Let's burn her to the stake. We'll get out some marshmallows or whatever. Doesn't care. He's indifferent almost. And, verse 25. It was while she was being brought out that she sent to her father-in-law saying, I am with child by the man whom these belong. And she said, please examine and see whose signet ring and cords and staff these are these. So suddenly, Judah, is being confronted in the worst possible way. We already know that he's sensitive about humiliation and embarrassment, right? He is. And to the point where he's, forget those things. I don't want to be a laughingstock. Now he's confronted directly. There are other people involved. Question I always ask myself at this time, could Judah have done something entirely different other than to confess his sin? What do you think Judah could have done? He could have called her a liar, drew his sword, and ran her through. He could have done that. Those are not mine. She stole them from the right prostitute that I slept with. He could have done that easily. But instead, what does he do? He's confronted by his sin. Suddenly, a thread of righteousness is connected in him. There's a spark of what is right in Judah. And he acknowledges suddenly that she, Tamar, even though she posed to be a temple prostitute, even though she was the reason in his mind for the death of his two sons, suddenly he's realizing that she is more righteous than I am. You see that? Verse 26. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not have relations with her again. So there in that verse, in fact in verse 25 and 26, is the reality of Judah being confronted with his sin, with his unrighteousness. And rather than perpetuate his unrighteousness by claiming that she's a liar and getting rid of her, burning her to the stake anyway as a liar, instead of doing this, he humbles himself and he acknowledges the truth publicly, regardless of the fact that everyone is observing. Again, clearly he had a sensitivity about being a laughingstock. His pride was an issue, as it is with most of us. But rather than defend himself, be self-righteous as he was, he humbled himself and he confessed his sin. She's more righteous than I am. The next thing we see, which is in next week's Torah portion, is that he is back with the tribes of Israel. That's the next time we see Judah in this whole story. He's reinstalled into the tribes of Israel once again. You see that? So let me capture the essence of what I want to see. Judah, chosen by God for leadership. What do you think? You think God chose him because Reuben failed, Levi and Simeon failed, and so the next in line was Judah? You think that was God's mode of operation? God just waited around to see if Reuben would, in fact, approve himself, if Simeon and Levi would do the same. And I'm left with Judah, so I'll have to work with Judah. What do you think? You think it's possible that Judah was foreordained? What do you think? I think it's entirely possible that from the very beginning God had chosen Judah. God is not necessarily entrapped by our traditions. If our traditions are that the firstborn will be the leader, that's our tradition. God is not committed to our traditions. We know that because of Jacob. Right? Jacob was the second born. God said the first son will serve the second son. God's not committed to our traditions. In fact, quite often he works completely outside of our traditions. Now you need to percolate on that for a while. And Jesus said that, didn't he? The Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, they were doing what they were doing because of tradition of man. Jesus made it clear how much he disdained man's traditions. Did he not? Right. So you see here, right, tradition, that Judah would not be the one to lead the family. Of course, God had another plan in mind. Judah was the one who God had chosen and gave him the necessary spirit to yield himself to ultimate service and leadership. Judah was the one chosen. The road that will bring Judah to that recognition, to that place, was a difficult road for Judah. A difficult road. Usually, folks, the road to leadership is a difficult road. Usually, typically fraught with all sorts of opportunities to say no. Usually, in terms of arriving at your call of leadership, there is opposition. Opposition, right? And you have to overcome. That's what we've been looking at, to the one who overcomes. Well, Judah overcame by reconnecting himself to the tribes of Israel, humbling himself and acknowledging his error openly before the entire community that he wanted to be a part of. He so wanted to be a Canaanite. He so wanted to be a Canaanite. But then he realized that I'm not a Canaanite, cannot be a Canaanite, I'm an Israelite. And he moves back to live with his brothers again and his father. And next week we'll see what happens. How Judah would lay his life down twice. Once again to Jacob, to Israel, and second to Joseph. When he lays his life down to Joseph, Joseph has at that moment an epiphany. So powerful was that epiphany that Joseph was moved to tears. Moved completely to tears. And at that moment, when Judah laid his life down, at that moment, Joseph said, that's it. I must reveal myself to my brothers. In other words, when Judah took the position of leadership over his brothers, the real, actual position of leadership, when he took that, and had to be taken, when he took it, that's when Joseph said, I see it complete now. God's plan is so obvious right now, and this is the time for me to share who I am with my brothers. Is it possible, and next week we'll talk about this, you think about it, is it possible that God, Yeshua Jesus, is waiting for leadership in Israel to manifest? What do you think? Based on the analogous picture here, I think it's true. I think God is waiting for leadership to arise in Israel, like Judah-type leadership, that would say, no one wants to lead, it is for me to lead. I'm going to lay my life down. And there are, folks, sons of Israel in the land of Israel that's doing that right now. They're doing it right now on the mountains of Judea and Samaria. They're laying their lives down. They are moving into that position that Judah would ultimately move into, the position of the leaders of Israel. They will be the rightful leadership of Israel. And at that time, perhaps, at that time, Jesus will reveal himself. So we'll talk about that next week. Right now, I want to bid you Shabbat Shalom.